All right, we're now talking about the cerebrum for section 3 of chapter 13 on the brain and cranial nerves. You should be able to describe the anatomic structure of the left and right cerebral hemispheres and explain their general functions after completing this section. Identify the role of the corpus callosum. Explain the physical boundaries, important features, and functions of each cerebral role. Locate and list the functions of the motor cortical regions and their association areas. Should also be able to differentiate among the sensory cortical regions and their association areas. Explain the functions of the prefrontal cortex and hypothesize why this brain region may function differently in adults and teenagers. Describe the main actions of the Wernicke area and identify the three main tracts of the central white matter. Should also be able to explain the phenomenon of cerebral lateralization, identify the functions of left and right hemispheres in most individuals, and describe the primary function of the cerebral nuclei, identify the 4 cerebral nuclei, and explain the specific function of each. So with the cerebrum is the origin of all the complex intellectual functions. There are 2 large hemispheres on the superior aspect of the brain. It's the center of intelligence and reasoning, thought, memory, judgment, voluntary motor, visual, and auditory activities. So the cerebrum is composed of left and right hemispheres. The longitudinal fissure is the deep cleft separating the hemispheres. At a few locations, white matter tracts connect the hemispheres. Corpus callosum is the largest tract, providing connection between them. Regions of the cerebrum may exhibit multiple functions. Some are not easily assigned to one specific region. Connections within the body are generally crossed with the cerebrum. The left hemisphere receives sensory signals from the right side of the body, and the sends motor signals to the right side of the body, as an example. Some higher order functions exhibit lateralization. They are primarily controlled by one side of the brain, like speech is frequently located in the left cerebral hemisphere. So the cerebral hemisphere here we have our left and our right cerebral hemisphere. We're looking at a superior view of our brain here. Being the frontal lobe here, that orangish color, and then kind of a little more reddish or reddish pinkish, if you will, more the parietal lobes, and our occipital lobes, the posterior back here. And remember we have our gyrus. These little guys kind of go back and forth all around, and our sulcus are the spaces between that matter of our brain, of the gyrus, of the different gyri, and sulci being the multiple for the spaces between. We have our precentral gyrus here, and our central sulcus here, postcentral gyrus right behind it here, and then we have our longitudinal fissure right down the middle between separating our left and right hemispheres of our cerebrum. So that there are 5 lobes in each hemisphere. 4 are named for overlying cranial bones: the frontal, the parietal, the temporal, and occipital. The insular lobe is not visible at the surface. The frontal lobe is the anterior part of the cerebrum. It's the posterior border is the deep central sulcus, and the precentral gyrus controls voluntary movement. The lateral sulcus separates the inferior frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. The frontal lobe has varied functions: motor control, concentration, verbal communication, decision-making, planning, and personality. The parietal lobe, the superior posterior part of the cerebrum, is the anterior border is the central sulcus. The postcentral gyrus is the ridge just posterior to the central sulcus. The posterior border is the parietal occipital sulcus. The lateral border is the lateral sulcus. And it serves general sensory functions, like evaluating shape and texture of objects. The temporal lobe is internal to the temporal bone. It's located inferior to the lateral sulcus. Its functions includes hearing and smell. The occipital lobe is the posterior part of the cerebrum, functions in vision and visual memories. The insula is deep to lateral sulcus. It's the small lobe that can be observed by pulling away the temporal lobe. It functions in memory and sense of taste. We haven't talked about before, that's why we had the asterisk there. The motor areas are housed within frontal lobes. The primary motor cortex is located in the precentral gyrus. It's also called the somatic motor area. That controls the skeletal muscle activity on the opposite side of the body. They project contralaterally, opposite side, within the brainstem or the spinal cord. The controlled body regions map as a motor homunculus, and distorted proportions of the body reflect the amount of cortex dedicated to each part. Hands are large on the homunculus because a large area of the brain controls their precise movements. So we see here the primary motor cortex, this little centralized area across the way here within the precentral gyrus. You can see it's a kind of a cool picture here, showing the functions here, more of our limb here, and then obviously more in the face, deeper within the cranium area in the body here. You can see how there's, here's your toes, ankle, knee, hip, trunk, shoulder, arm, elbow, forearm, wrist, hand. Then you have all of these here for little finger, ring finger, middle finger, index finger, thumb, how much more proportionally is spent more toward like the hand here, and that region here, relative to what is really essentially the entirety of the appendages otherwise. Same here for aspects on the head and face here, the neck, eyelid and eyeball, face, lips, and jaws. A lot going on for sensory here, as well as the tongue and the pharynx, significant amounts there. So for motor areas, with motor speech area, the Broca area, it's located in the inferior lateral portion of the left frontal lobe in most people. It controls movements for vocalization. Our frontal eye field is on the superior surface of the middle frontal gyrus. It regulates eye movements needed for reading and binocular vision. Our premotor cortex, the somatic motor association area, is located anterior to the premotor cortex. It coordinates learned, skilled activities. Now our sensory areas, the cerebrum here, our primary somatosensory cortex is located in the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobes. It receives somatic sensory information from the proprioceptors, touch, pressure, pain, temperature receptors, all of those, getting basically sensory information or afferent information coming to them, right? To the cortex here for integration, for determining what to do. The areas of the body sending input can be mapped as a sensory homunculus. Basically, distorted proportions reflect the amount of sensory information collected from that region, of that afferent information. Large regions for lips, fingers, genital regions. Somatosensory association area, it's immediately posterior to the postcentral gyrus in the parietal lobe. It integrates touch information, allowing us to identify objects by feel. So here we have our primary somatosensory cortex crossed here within our postcentral gyrus. You can see once again, now we have quite a bit here for the genitals and leg, but the leg, foot, and toes is the same as it is for the genitals here, generally speaking, proportionally. Hip, trunk, neck, shoulder, arm, elbow, forearm, wrist. Then we get, again, little finger, ring finger, middle finger, index finger, a lot going on for the hand right there, and a lot of space for thumb, eye, nose, face, lips, teeth, gums, and jaw. Significant amount of sensory information there with tongue, pharynx, as well as intra-abdominal here as well. You can see how much more proportionally is spent for the areas of the face and basically structures of feel for that region and the hands once again. Now sensory is continued for the cerebrum. The primary visual cortex is located within the occipital lobe. It's the visual association area. It surrounds our primary visual cortex. It integrates color, form, memory. It allows us to identify things we see, like faces. The primary auditory cortex is located within the temporal lobe, closer to the ear, would make sense. Yeah, well, it seems to make sense considering the fact that we get to the occipital, which is more a region for vision, so it doesn't necessarily hold that way, does it? Auditory association area is located in the temporal lobe, interprets sounds, stores and retrieves memories of sounds. Our primary olfactory cortex is located in the temporal lobe, provides conscious awareness of smells, and our primary gustatory cortex is located within the insula. It is involved in processing taste information. As far as other functional brain regions here, we're talking about integration of information from multiple association areas. We have our prefrontal cortex, which is located rostral to the premotor cortex in the frontal lobe. Complex thought, judgment, personality, planning, and deciding occurs here. It's still developing in adolescence. The Wernicke area is typically located in the left hemisphere. It's involved in language comprehension. Now, autism spectrum disorder, talk briefly about it here. One of the many things that you certainly should understand longer term, which will be tested on it for this unit. Autism affects 1 in 88 U.S. children, so not as much as 2%, but more than 1%. It's characterized by social and communication difficulties. Severity varies across autism spectrum. The best predictors of independent adulthood are intelligence and communication ability. Specific causes are unknown. Genetic, environmental, biochemical factors have been all explored. Males have 4 times higher incidence than females do, and vaccines are found to not be a factor with autism. Our central white matter, which is deep to our gray cerebral cortex, is composed of myelinated axons are grouped into tracts, and association tracts, which connect regions of the cerebral cortex within the same hemisphere. Our acute fibers are short tracts connecting our neighboring gyri. Our longitudinal fasciculi are longer tracts connecting gyri in different lobes. And our commissural tracts are commissures connecting regions in different hemispheres, includes our corpus callosum, anterior and posterior commissure. Here we can see our central cerebral white matter tracts, our sagittal view, our corpus callosum here, our parietal lobe, our occipital lobe, Our arcuate fibers, you're seeing here, longitudinal fasciculi, our frontal lobe, the anterior commissure here, and it'd be our temporal lobe here, all for the sagittal view. As far as projection tracts within the central white matter, they link our cerebral cortex to the inferior brain regions of the spinal cord. Examples are corticospinal tracts that carry signals from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. As this projection tract passes between the thalamus and the cerebral nuclei, it is called the internal capsule. We have our cerebral white matter tracts, the coronal section here. You can see, I'll go with a little zoom in here. Our longitudinal fissure down the middle here, and of course our cortex, that gray matter there, and we have our cerebral nuclei here, our lateral sulcus separating those gyrus, or gyri, if you will, lateral sulcus separating the two. Then we have our projection tracts all along here, then the pons here, and then the decussation or decussation in the pyramids here, and they cross, medulla, and the medulla oblongata region, and of course the spinal cord. Then we have the corpus callosum here, with the lateral ventricle space, and our thalamus. We have our internal capsule, and our third ventricle here. Now, Petalias are anatomical asymmetries. A lot of cases, you'll have people will have one side of the brain a little bit different, a little bit asymmetrical than the other, or asymmetrical from standpoint one to the other. There are protrusions of a lobe on one side compared to the other side. Right-handed individuals tend to have right frontal Petalias and left occipital Petalias, generally speaking. Particularly the more dominant they are, the more you might see more asymmetry. Left-handed individuals tend to show the opposite. As far as hemisphere specialization or cerebral lateralization, two sides of the cerebrum exhibit differences in higher order functions. Categorical hemisphere is usually the left hemisphere, specialized for language abilities, functions, and categorization and analysis. Contains the Wernicke area on that left hemisphere and motor speech area. The representational hemisphere is usually the right side, the right hemisphere of the cerebrum. It's concerned with visual spatial relationships, imagination, and comparison of senses. You have people talking about using their left brain versus their right brain is what they're talking about. The two hemispheres communicate through the corpus callosum and other commissures. Now, lateralization develops in early childhood. It's seen prior to 5 to 6 years of age. Lateralization differs between sexes. Women's posterior corpus callosum is thicker, more connections. Males suffer more functional loss when one hemisphere is damaged. Lateralization is correlated with handedness. In right-handers, the left hemisphere is almost always categorical, speech dominant, and left-handed individuals may have either hemisphere be categorical. Interesting, my 5-year-old, my daughter has shown affinity for both sides. We'll see where that leads us with this information and the tendencies we tend to see. I'll go zoom in here. So we have for left hand, right hand, we have our left visual field and right visual field from our eye here, left eye, and our right eye, the opposite here with left visual field and right visual field here, crossing patterns there. For our left hemisphere, our categorical hemisphere, or our verbal memory, our speech motor area, our right hand motor control here. We are feeling shapes with the right hand, our superior language and mathematical comprehension, Wernicke area, and our right visual field, part of our primary visual cortex, and the posterior part of the cerebrum here. And then we have on the right side, our right hemisphere, representational hemisphere, memory for shapes, limited language comprehension, corpus callosum down the middle here. Left hand motor control, feeling shapes with left hand, musical ability. Wonder if my side is not developed well. That said, recognition of faces and spatial relationships, and left visual field. And as far as epilepsy and cerebral lateralization, epilepsy is a neurological disorder. Neurons transmitting action potentials are too frequently, its potentials are transmitted too frequently and rapidly. Usually controlled by medication, but may require surgical removal of part of the brain. In more severe cases, it can require a hemispherectomy, removal of the side of the brain responsible for seizure activity, and the remaining hemisphere is able to take over some functions of the missing hemisphere. So for a cerebrovascular accident or a stroke, which will be covered a lot more when we get to cardiovascular system in semester 2 with Bio 247. As a reduced blood supply to the part of the brain is due to blocked arterial blood vessels or hemorrhage. It can cause brain tissue death if it's prolonged for several minutes. Symptoms include blurred vision, weakness, headache, dizziness, walking difficulty, and affects the opposite side of the body. A brief episode is a transient ischemic attack, or TIA. Our cerebral nuclei is a gray matter deep in the cerebrum, helps regulate motor output. Diseases of these nuclei are associated with involuntary movements. The caudate nucleus is an enlarged head and slender tail paralleling lateral ventricle, helps produce our pattern and rhythm of walking movements. Lentiform nucleus is a rounded mass between the insula and the diencephalon. It's composed of putamen and globus pallidus. The putamen helps control movements at subconscious level, and the globus pallidus influences the thalamus to adjust muscle tone. Our colostrum is a thin sliver of gray matter immediately internal to the insular cortex, processes visual information on the subconscious level. Our amygdaloid complex, or body, is amygdala. It's expanded region of the tail of the caudate nucleus. It functions in mood and emotions, our amygdala. Our corpus striatum is a striated or striped appearance of the internal capsule. So we can see here, we have our cerebral cortex, our corpus callosum, our lateral ventricle, our septum pellucidum, our thalamus, our internal capsule, our insula, the lateral sulcus here, our third ventricle here, our optic tract, our hypothalamus. Then we have our cerebral nuclei, we have our caudate nucleus, we have our putamen here, we have our globus pallidus, all part of the lentiform nucleus there, the two of them, on the colostrum here, amygdaloid body, and of course that's all this whole section here is part of the corpus striatum. For brain disorders, headaches are typically due to dilated blood vessels in the skull or muscle contraction. Migraine headaches are severe, recurring, often unilateral, but they're not a true brain disorder, but they may accompany them. Cerebral palsy is a group of neuromuscular disorders that result from damage to the infant brain before, during, or after birth. Impairment of skeletal muscle, sometimes mental retardation. They're often looking for that right at birth or after birth. Huntington's disease, it's a hereditary disease that affects the cerebral nuclei, rapid, jerky, involuntary movements, intellectual deterioration. It's fatal within 10 to 20 years after onset. Parkinson's disease affects muscle movement and balance, stiff posture, slow voluntary movements, resting tremors. It's caused by decreased dopamine production in the substantia nigra. So what did you learn? What's the general function of the cerebrum? What's the function of the corpus callosum? List the 5 cerebral lobes and the main functions of each. Where is each of the motor areas located and what are their functions? In general, what is the purpose of association areas? Why does the prefrontal cortex perform differently in a teenager versus an adult? What portions of the brain are linked by each type of tract, association, commissural, and projection tracts? What portions of the brain are linked by each type of tract, association, commissural, and projection tracts? What are the primary functions of the left cerebral hemisphere, of the right cerebral hemisphere? What's the general function of the cerebral nuclei, and what are the anatomic components of nuclei? We'll come back for diencephalon in section 4 shortly here.